When a waitress mocked a millionaire's fall, she never expected the price she'd pay, or the astonishing secret that would change everything. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The surveillance footage would loop endlessly across social media for days. Harold Morrison, one of Boston's most prominent real estate moguls, slipping on a puddle of spilled coffee in Rosemary's Diner. His perfectly tailored Armani suit skidding across the checkered linoleum, his legendary composure shattering as his legs flew up, arms windmilling helplessly before he crashed to the floor. But it wasn't the fall that would haunt him. It was the laughter, specifically the clear, mocking tone of Sarah Chen, the waitress who had mopped that floor moments earlier. "Guess money can't buy balance," she had quipped, loud enough for the morning crowd to hear. The diner erupted in snickers, phones already recording, sharing, spreading the moment like wildfire. Harold had pulled himself up slowly, his face a mask of cold dignity. He straightened his tie, brushed off his jacket, and walked out without a word. But those who knew him well would have recognized the dangerous glint in his steel-gray eyes. Harold Morrison had built an empire by destroying anyone who crossed him, and as he slid into the back of his waiting Bentley, his mind was already calculating the precise cost of Sarah Chen's destruction. He didn't know about her mother's mounting medical bills, or the second job she worked to keep them both afloat. He hadn't noticed the dark circles under her eyes from working double shifts, or the way her hands trembled slightly as she carried plates of eggs and toast to tired morning commuters. And Sarah, riding the momentary high of her viral quip, couldn't have known about the leather-bound diary sitting in Harold's office safe. The one his late wife Eleanor had left behind, filled with observations about the man he'd become, and a final wish that would soon shatter everything he thought he wanted. "Take me to the office," Harold instructed his driver, pulling out his phone, "and get me everything you can find on Sarah Chen. Everything." The driver nodded, catching his employer's expression in the rearview mirror. He had seen that look before, right before Harold had systematically dismantled his last competitor's life, but this time felt different. This wasn't business. It was personal. As the Bentley glided through Boston's morning traffic, Harold began making calls. By nightfall, he would own the diner. By the end of the week, he would control every aspect of Sarah Chen's fragile existence. And then, piece by piece, he would show her exactly what happened to people who dared to mock Harold Morrison. But fate, and Eleanor's hidden words, had other plans. Sarah noticed the changes slowly at first. It started with small things. Her regular customers suddenly stopping their visits, her best tables being reassigned to other servers, her shifts getting cut without explanation. The diner felt different too. New management had swept in overnight, bringing with them crisp corporate policies and cold efficiency that stripped away the warmth that had made Rosemary's feel like home for the past 3 years. "Business decision," the new manager had said, sliding a revised schedule across the counter. Sarah stared at the paper, her heart sinking. Her hours had been cut in half. Nothing personal, but it felt personal, especially when she arrived home that evening to find a notice taped to her apartment door. Her building had been sold, and the new owner was renovating. All tenants had 30 days to vacate. Sarah's hands trembled as she unlocked her door, her mind racing. Her mother's voice drifted from the small living room where she spent her days, tethered to an oxygen machine they could barely afford. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" "Fine, Mom," Sarah called back, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "Just some building maintenance stuff." She collapsed onto a kitchen chair, pulling out her phone to check her bank balance. The numbers glared back at her, mocking her optimism. Without her full shifts at the diner, they wouldn't make it through the month, let alone manage a move. Across town, in his penthouse office, Harold Morrison watched Sarah's world crumble through a series of real-time updates on his tablet. Property acquisition, schedule adjustments, strategic cancellations of regular customer accounts, each move precisely calculated, each response carefully monitored. "Sir," his assistant entered with a fresh coffee, "the care facility paperwork has arrived for your review." Harold nodded, taking the folder. Sweet Haven Care Home, where Sarah's mother spent her days when Sarah worked her second job. Soon to be another acquisition in his portfolio. Soon to be another pressure point. But as he reached for his pen, something caught his eye. A small leather-bound book had fallen from the stack of papers his assistant brought in, old documents from archive storage he'd requested for the facility's background check. "What's this?" he muttered, picking up the book. His breath caught as he recognized the delicate handwriting on the first page. Property of Eleanor Morrison. Harold's hand froze. He hadn't seen his wife's diary since her death 2 years ago. He'd locked away everything that reminded him of her, focused on building his empire higher, stronger, safer from the pain of loss. "Sir," his assistant prompted, "the paperwork?" "Leave it," Harold ordered, his voice rough, "and clear my schedule for the afternoon." Alone in his office, Harold stared at the diary. Eleanor's last words to him still unread, still sealed away with his grief. Part of him wanted to lock it away again, to continue with his plan unburdened by her memory. Instead, his fingers trembled as he opened to the first page. "My dearest Harold, I worry about you, about what you're becoming." The words blurred before his eyes, but before he could read more, his phone buzzed with an update. Sarah Chen had just left the diner crying after being informed her shifts next week were canceled entirely. Harold closed the diary, sliding it into his desk drawer. He had a plan to execute. Eleanor's words, whatever wisdom or warning they held, would have to wait. But as he turned back to the care facility paperwork, her handwriting seemed to burn in his memory. "What you're becoming." He didn't notice his hand shaking as he signed the acquisition papers, setting in motion the next phase of Sarah's destruction. And he certainly didn't notice the single tear that splashed onto the page, smudging his signature. Some stains, after all, never quite wash away. For a moment, Harold stared at the smudged signature, memories threatening to break through his carefully constructed walls. Eleanor had always told him he felt things too deeply, that his drive to never appear vulnerable again would eventually cost him something precious. But what did she know? She'd left him, after all. Left him alone in this penthouse with its perfect view of a city he was slowly consuming, piece by piece. He pressed the intercom. "Get me an update on Sarah Chen's second job." Minutes later, his assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. "The boutique where she works weekends. They're experiencing some unexpected licensing issues. They'll need to reduce staff immediately." "Make sure she's first to go," Harold said, his voice flat. He ignored the way Eleanor's diary seemed to pulse in his drawer, like a beating heart in one of those gothic stories she used to love reading to him on rainy Sunday mornings. Across the city, Sarah sat in her car outside the boutique, staring at her second pink slip of the day. Through her windshield, she could see Mrs. Rodriguez, the owner, arguing with some city officials. Their eyes met briefly, and Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head sadly, helplessly. "It's not right," she had whispered to Sarah minutes earlier, handling her the termination notice. 20 years I run this shop, never a single violation. Now, suddenly, they find problems everywhere. Someone's pulling strings, Makita. Someone powerful." Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from her mother's doctor. The insurance was questioning their coverage. A review had been triggered. They needed to discuss alternative care options. The pieces started clicking together in Sarah's mind. The diner's sudden sale, the apartment building's convenient renovation, the boutique's mysterious violations, her mother's insurance issues. It couldn't all be coincidence. And her hands gripped the steering wheel as she remembered that morning at the diner, the sound of her own laughter mixing with the crowd's, the cold fury in Harold Morrison's eyes as he'd straightened his tie. "Oh, God," she whispered. "What have I done?" Back in his office, Harold allowed himself a small smile as another update lit up his tablet. Sarah Chen had just pulled into a gas station, presumably to cry in private. His network of surveillance cameras showed her slumped over her steering wheel, shoulders shaking. Good. Let her feel small. Let her understand what it meant to. The drawer containing Eleanor's diary slid open on its own. a trick of the building's settling, or perhaps something more ethereal. The leather corner peeked out, catching the late afternoon sun. Harold slammed the drawer shut, standing abruptly. He walked to the window, staring out at his domain. From up here, people looked like ants, scurrying about their insignificant lives. He could crush them without a thought, just like his father had crushed him, all those years ago, before Eleanor had found him sleeping in his car, too proud to admit he was broke. Before she'd believed in him, invested her family's money in his first real estate deal, shown him there was more to strength than destruction. "Damn it, Eleanor," he whispered to the glass. "Why did you leave that diary?" His phone buzzed again. Sweet Haven Care Homes Board had approved the sale. He now controlled the facility that kept Sarah's mother alive. Harold Morrison had won. Sarah Chen was finished. So why did victory taste like ashes in his mouth? Night had settled over Boston, but Harold Morrison remained in his office, Eleanor's diary untouched on his desk. The city lights below mimicked the stars, a false constellation of power and wealth he'd spent years building. His tablet continued to ping with updates about Sarah Chen, her desperate phone calls to other restaurants, the growing stack of past-due notices in her mailbox, her mother's deteriorating condition. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, each update felt like a weight pressing against his chest. Finally, after his third scotch, he opened the diary. "My dearest Harold," Eleanor's elegant handwriting flowed across the page. "I worry about you, about what you're becoming. Today, at dinner, you spoke for an hour about destroying the Thompson family's business. You called it justice. I called it what it was, revenge. You didn't hear the difference, and that terrifies me." Harold's hands tightened on the leather cover. He remembered that dinner. James Thompson had tried to undercut one of his developments. Harold had spent millions ensuring the man would never work in Boston again. He turned the page. "I visited the homeless shelter again today. There's a young man there. Reminds me of you when we first met. Proud, angry, convinced the world owes him something. I told him your story, about sleeping in your car, refusing to ask for help, about how true strength isn't in destroying others, but in rising above your pain to help them rise too." The scotch burned in Harold's throat. Eleanor had never told him about her volunteer work. She'd kept that part of her life private, knowing he'd disapprove, knowing he'd see it as beneath them. "Sometimes I walk by that old parking lot where I found you, remember? You were wearing your last good suit, pretending you were just taking a break between meetings. But I saw the truth in your eyes, the same truth I see now, though you hide it better. The fear of being small again, of being laughed at, of being nothing." In the margins, Eleanor had sketched a small heart. Harold traced it with his finger, remembering how she used to draw them on his morning papers, on his contracts, on anything she thought needed softening. His tablet pinged again. Sarah Chen was at her mother's bedside in Sweet Haven, begging the night nurse for information about the facility's sudden ownership change. The audio feed crackled with her tearful voice. "Please, she can't be moved. She's not strong enough." Harold minimized the feed, but Eleanor's words seemed to float off the page. "I see how you look at people now, like they're beneath you, like their struggles are somehow deserved. Have you forgotten? Has success blinded you so completely to your own past?" He flipped forward, pages blurring until a date caught his eye. 3 days before her death. "My time is short now, my love. The doctors try to soften it, but I see the truth in their eyes too. I'm not afraid of dying, but I am afraid of what my loss might do to your heart. You've built walls so high, fortified them with wealth and power and pride. I fear that without me to remind you of who you really are, you'll become exactly what your father was, a man who measures his worth by how many others he can break." Harold's chest tightened. He stood abruptly, walking to the window. Below, emergency lights flashed outside Sweet Haven. An ambulance? His phone buzzed. Sarah's mother had suffered a stress-induced episode. Sarah couldn't afford the extra care now required. Not with both her jobs gone, not with an eviction looming. His own voice echoed in his head, "Let her feel small." But Eleanor's words burned brighter. "Has success blinded you so completely?" He turned back to the diary, to its final entry. "My last wish, my darling, is not for you to mourn me, but to remember me by remembering yourself. That young man who slept in his car but still shared his last dollar with a homeless veteran. The man who promised to make the world better, not just richer. The man I fell in love with. If you're reading this, it means you've forgotten him. It means you're hurting someone, convinced it's justice when it's just fear dressed up as power. Stop, remember, find that man again. And when you do, help others find themselves too. That's my dream for you, my love. Not an empire of broken souls, but a legacy of healed ones. With eternal love and hope, Eleanor." Harold sank into his chair, the diary trembling in his hands. On his tablet, security footage showed Sarah Chen slumped in a hospital chair holding her mother's frail hand, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Has success blinded you so completely?" His finger hovered over the tablet's screen. One call could restore Sarah's jobs. One signature could secure her mother's care. One moment of grace could— No. She had humiliated him. She had to learn. Learn what? Eleanor's voice seemed to whisper. That pain repaid with pain only breeds more suffering. Harold Morrison, master of half of Boston's skyline, sat alone in his tower, caught between the man he'd become and the man his wife had loved. Below, in a stark hospital room, Sarah Chen whispered desperate promises to her sleeping mother, unaware that her fate rested in the hands of a man being haunted by his wife's last words. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. And the knight, indifferent to both their struggles, waited to see which path Harold would choose. Dawn crept over Boston, painting the city in shades of gold and promise. Harold hadn't slept. Eleanor's diary lay open on his desk, its pages marked with dried teardrops he'd never admit to shedding. His tablet had fallen silent hours ago, the last update showing Sarah Chen finally succumbing to exhaustion in her mother's hospital room. He picked up his phone, then set it down again. Picked it up, set it down. Each movement a battle between pride and conscience, between the man he'd become and the man Eleanor had loved. "Anderson," he finally spoke into the intercom, his voice rough from a sleepless night. "Come in here." His assistant appeared instantly, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "Sir, the Chen situation." Harold's fingers traced Eleanor's signature on the diary's last page. "I need you to—" "We've just received an update, sir," Anderson interrupted, unusually eager. "Sweet Haven's board approved the accelerated timeline. We can begin transfer proceedings for Mrs. Chen this morning, and the apartment eviction." "Stop!" Harold closed his eyes. In his mind, Eleanor's words danced. "Remember yourself." "Sir?" "Cancel it, all of it." Anderson blinked. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." Harold stood, walking to the window. The morning sun caught his reflection. When had he started looking so much like his father? Cancel the eviction, reinstate the original ownership of the diner. Whatever licensing issues the boutique is having, make them disappear. "But, sir, you said—" "I know what I said." Harold turned, and something in his expression made Anderson step back. "Tell me, how long have you worked for me?" 8 years, sir. And in those 8 years, how many lives have we destroyed? How many people have we crushed because they dared to cross us?" Anderson shifted uncomfortably. I've never kept count. But Eleanor did." Harold tapped the diary. "Every single one. She wrote about them all, their names, their families, their struggles afterward. She saw what I couldn't, what I wouldn't. That every time I broke someone to prove my own strength, I was really just that scared kid in a parking lot again, trying to convince myself I was powerful." He picked up his tablet, pulling up the hospital security feed. Sarah was awake now, gently brushing her mother's hair, whispering something they couldn't hear. "Sir," Anderson ventured carefully, "what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying it's time I lived up to Eleanor's last wish." Harold straightened his tie, a gesture of resolve rather than pride this time. "We're going to fix this. All of it. And then, we're going to fix everything else, too." Everything else. Every life I've broken, every family I've crushed. Eleanor kept records, names, dates, details. He patted the diary. "It's all here, and we're going to make it right." Anderson stared at his boss, searching for signs of temporary insanity. That could take years, cost millions. "Good thing I can afford it, then." Harold's smile held a hint of his old sharpness, but tempered now with something softer. "Start with Sarah Chen. But do it quietly. I don't want recognition. I don't want gratitude. I just want—" "Peace," Eleanor's voice seemed to whisper. "Sir?" Anderson prompted, and "Never mind, just make it happen. And Anderson, get my lawyers on the phone. It's time to set up the Eleanor Morrison Foundation. Something to help people who've fallen on hard times. People who just need a second chance, like I once did." As Anderson hurried out, Harold turned back to the window. Below, Boston was fully awake now, millions of lives intersecting, each one carrying their own struggles, their own potential for redemption. His tablet lit up with a new alert. Sarah Chen was leaving the hospital, her shoulders bowed but her head still high. Even now, even broken, she refused to be truly beaten. He recognized that strength. He'd had it once before he'd confused wealth with worth. "Watch, Eleanor," he whispered to the rising sun. "Watch what your love can still do." But healing, like destruction, takes time. And Sarah Chen's path to restoration would reveal something even Eleanor hadn't foreseen in her final pages. A truth about redemption that would change not just 2 lives, but an entire city. The sun climbed higher, warming the pages of Eleanor's diary, still open to her last entry. And below her signature, in Harold's fresh handwriting, a new line appeared. "I remember now, and I promise, no more broken souls, only healed ones, starting today." The changes in Sarah's life began as mysteriously as the troubles had. First, the boutique's licensing issues vanished overnight. Mrs. Rodriguez called early one morning, her voice trembling with joy. "It's a miracle, mijita. The violations, they're gone. All gone. Come back to work, please." Then the new owner of her apartment building suddenly reversed course. "Renovations postponed indefinitely," the notice read. "All current tenants may remain under existing lease terms." But it was the letter from Sweet Haven that brought Sarah to her knees in her tiny kitchen. Her mother's care was not only secured, it was fully funded for the next 5 years through an anonymous donors grant program. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, papers trembling in her hands. "How is this happening?" Her phone buzzed. The diner's new manager calling to offer her old shifts back. "With a raise," he added awkwardly, "and, better tables." Sarah sat in stunned silence trying to piece it together. The timing was too perfect, the reversals too complete. Someone was orchestrating this, but who? And, more importantly, why? Across town, Harold watched the surveillance feeds less frequently now. He'd instructed Anderson to dismantle most of the monitoring systems, keeping only enough to ensure his help reached the right places at the right times. "The Thompson family file, sir." Anderson placed a thick folder on his desk. "As requested." Harold nodded, adding it to the growing stack. Eleanor's diary had become his roadmap, each entry pointing to another life he needed to repair. James Thompson had been one of his first victims, a developer whose family business Harold had systematically destroyed 5 years ago. "Have you found them?" Harold asked. Anderson's expression tightened. "Yes, sir. They're not doing well. Mr. Thompson never recovered. He's working as a night security guard in Worcester. His daughter had to drop out of college, his wife— Enough, Harold held up his hand. Just send them the same arrangement we made for the Chen family. Anonymous donor, fresh start package. Sir? Anderson shifted uncomfortably. There might be a problem with that. Harold looked up sharply. What kind of problem? Someone's asking questions about the Chen reversals. A reporter from the Boston Globe. She's good, connecting dots we thought we'd covered. Harold's jaw tightened. On his desk, Eleanor's diary seemed to pulse with silent warning. How much does she know? Nothing concrete yet, but she's interviewed Sarah Chen. She's looking into the timing of everything. The diner sale, Sweet Haven's ownership changes, the boutique licenses. She thinks there's a story here. Harold stood, walking to his window. The morning sun caught his reflection. Had his eyes always held this much worry? Find out what she knows, he said finally. But don't interfere. No pressure, no threats. Those days are over. And if she discovers the truth about your involvement? Harold touched the window, remembering Eleanor's words about true strength. Then we'll deal with it honestly. But for now, his phone buzzed. A text from the private investigator he'd hired to track down more names from Eleanor's diary. Another family in need of restoration, another wrong to right. But before he could read it, Anderson cleared his throat. Sir, there's one more thing. Harold looked up. Sarah Chen, she started asking questions too, and she's here, in the lobby. Harold's heart stopped. Through the building's security feed he could see her, still in her waitress uniform, clutching a familiar piece of paper. Even through the grainy footage he recognized it, the Sweet Haven grant letter, with its tiny, traceable inconsistency in the letterhead. She had figured it out. Send her up, Harold said quietly. Anderson's eyes widened. Are you sure that's— She deserves the truth. Harold opened Eleanor's diary to its final page. And maybe it's time everyone knew. As the elevator began its climb, Harold stood at his window watching Boston spread out below. Somewhere out there, the Thompson family was about to receive unexpected salvation. Somewhere, a reporter was connecting dots that would expose either his redemption or his downfall. And in less than 60 seconds, Sarah Chen would walk through his door, seeking answers he wasn't sure he was ready to give. The elevator dinged. Harold took a deep breath, touching Eleanor's diary one last time. Watch, he whispered. This is where it gets complicated. Behind him, his office door opened. Sarah Chen stepped into Harold Morrison's office with her head high, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The space screamed power, floor-to-ceiling windows, modern art worth more than she'd make in a lifetime, a desk that could have paid her mother's medical bills for a year. And behind that desk stood the man who had nearly destroyed her life. Or had he saved it? The question burned in her throat. Miss Chen. Harold's voice was quieter than she remembered. He hadn't turned from the window. I've been expecting you. Have you? Sarah pulled the Sweet Haven grant letter from her bag. Like you expected my mother's care facility to suddenly get an anonymous donor? Like you expected all my problems to magically disappear? Now he did turn, and something in his expression made her step back. The cold arrogance she remembered from the diner was gone, replaced by something she couldn't quite read. Nothing magical about it, he said. Just a correction, of course. A correction? Sarah's laugh held no humor. You systematically destroyed my life, my jobs, my home, my mother's care. You took everything. And now what? You feel guilty? Is this some kind of rich man's penance? Harold's eyes flickered to something on his desk. A book, old and worn. You're right, about most of it. He gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Please, sit. You deserve an explanation. I deserve a lot of things. Yes, he said simply, you do. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She sat, noting how he remained standing, as if unsure of his place in his own office. "I read your employee file," he said quietly. 3 years at the diner, never late, double shifts whenever offered, supporting your mother alone since your father passed, top customer service ratings." He paused. "And one moment of human reaction to a prideful man's fall." Sarah's throat tightened. "If you're trying to make me apologize—" "No." Harold held up a hand. "I'm trying to apologize to you." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken things. "I became—" Harold seemed to search for words. "I became something I promised I'd never be. Someone who used power to break others because I couldn't bear being laughed at, being seen as weak." He picked up the worn book from his desk. "My wife, Eleanor. She saw it happening. She left this diary, hoping." He stopped, and Sarah was stunned to see his hands shaking slightly. "The diner," she said, realization dawning. "You didn't just target me randomly. You bought it because I could, because I wanted you to feel as small as I felt when you laughed." "Yes." He opened the diary. "But Eleanor wrote something here, the day before she died, about a young waitress she met working 2 jobs to care for her sick mother, about how this waitress shared her lunch with a homeless man outside the diner, even though she clearly couldn't afford to." Sarah's breath caught. She remembered that day. Eleanor had been so kind, leaving an unusually large tip and a note that said simply, "Kindness matters." "That was your wife?" Harold nodded. "She saw in you what I couldn't, what I refused to see because I was too busy planning your destruction." He smiled sadly. "Eleanor always could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." "So all this, fixing everything you broke, it's because of her?" "Because of her, because of you, because it's time I remembered who I was before success made me forget." He held out the diary. "Here, read the last entry. She wrote it for people like you, people who show kindness even when life hasn't been kind to them." Sarah took the diary with trembling hands, but before she could open it, Harold's office door burst open. Anderson rushed in, his usual composure shattered. "Sir, the Globe reporter, she's published the story. It's everywhere." Harold's tablet lit up with notifications. His phone began ringing incessantly. On the TV mounted in the corner, a breaking news banner scrolled, "Morrison's Secret Revenge. Billionaire's Systematic Destruction of Waitress's Life Exposed." Sarah stared at the screen, then at Harold, then at the diary in her hands. The story was only half right. They didn't know about his change of heart, about Eleanor's influence, about the redemption already in motion. "They're calling for your resignation from the board," Anderson continued. "Investors are panicking. The stock is—" "Let them panic," Harold said quietly, surprising them both. He turned to Sarah. "The truth always comes out, but rarely all at once, and rarely in the way we expect." He reached for his phone, but not to answer the dozens of missed calls from his PR team. Instead, he pulled up a familiar number. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "Calling the Globe." Harold's eyes met hers. "It's time they heard the whole story, from both of us, if you're willing." Sarah looked down at Eleanor's diary, then at the chaos unfolding on the TV screen. The choice before her was clear. She could watch Harold Morrison's empire crumble under half-truths, or she could help tell a story about something far more powerful, the possibility of change, the power of second chances, the legacy of a woman who believed in kindness above all. "Well?" Harold asked softly. "What do you say?" Sarah stared at the diary in her hands, then at the chaos unfolding on the TV screen. The reporter had only scratched the surface. She had the what, but not the why, the revenge, but not the redemption, the fall, but not the rise. "Time's running out," Harold said quietly. "Once the morning shows pick this up—" "Why me?" Sarah interrupted. "Why do you want me to help tell your story?" "Because it's not my story." Harold gestured to the diary. "It's Eleanor's, and yours, and every other person I've hurt and tried to heal. I'm just the bridge between the breaking and the fixing. On the TV, the story kept growing. Social media exploded with hashtags. #Morrison Revenge, #Justice for Sarah, #Boycott Morrison. The narrative was spiraling, taking on a life of its own. Sarah opened the diary to its last entry, reading Eleanor's words about kindness and redemption, about seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. "Okay," she said finally, "but we do this my way." Harold raised an eyebrow. No PR team, no corporate spin, just truth. All of it. The ugly parts and the beautiful parts. "That could cost me everything," Harold said. "Isn't that what Eleanor would have wanted? Everything you built given back to heal what you broke?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Harold's phone buzzed again, his board of directors demanding an emergency meeting. On screen, competitors were already circling, sensing blood in the water. Years of carefully constructed power teetering on the edge of collapse. "Anderson," Harold called. His assistant appeared instantly. "Set up the interview, but not here." He looked at Sarah, "At the diner, where it all began." "Sir," Anderson protested, "the optics—" "Will be perfect," Sarah finished. "Real, raw, human." An hour later, they sat across from each other in Rosemary's Diner. The morning rush had ground to a halt as customers recognized them, phones recording every moment. The Globe reporter, Emma Martinez, sat between them, her recorder catching every word. "Start at the beginning," Emma said. "Not the fall, not the revenge. The real beginning." Harold touched Eleanor's diary, now sitting between them like a bridge. It started in a parking lot 20 years ago. I was sleeping in my car, too proud to admit I'd failed. As he spoke, Sarah watched his mask crumble completely. He talked about Eleanor finding him, about her belief in second chances, about how success had slowly poisoned his heart. His voice broke when he described reading her diary for the first time, realizing what he'd become. Then it was Sarah's turn. She spoke about her mother's illness, about working double shifts, about the day Eleanor had visited the diner, about laughter that turned cruel and consequences that seemed too perfect to be random. "But here's what your first story missed," Sarah said, meeting Emma's eyes. "It's not just about revenge, it's about redemption, about someone choosing to break the cycle of pain." "By throwing money at his problems," Emma challenged. "No," Harold interrupted. "By remembering who I was before money meant more than mercy." He pulled out his phone, pulling up a document. "That's why, as of this morning, I'm announcing the creation of the Eleanor Morrison Foundation, funded by 50% of my personal wealth." The diner fell silent. Even Emma's professional composure cracked. 50%? She repeated. "That's about $8 billion, Harold finished. "Dedicated to helping people who need second chances, starting with every person I've hurt over the years." He slid another document across the table. "Sarah will be on the board of directors, along with James Thompson and others I've wronged. They'll ensure the money goes where it's needed most." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the paperwork. Her name, there in black and white, given power to help others who'd been broken by pride and circumstance. "This isn't damage control," she added, seeing Emma's skepticism. "He started this before your story broke, before anyone knew. I have proof." She pulled out her own documents. The Sweet Haven grant, the boutique's licensing reversal, the apartment paperwork, all dated before the scandal erupted. Emma's eyes widened as she pieced it together. So, the real story is about change, Harold said quietly, about a man who forgot himself and the women who helped him remember. He touched Eleanor's diary, one through her death, one through her laughter. Outside the diner's windows, a crowd had gathered. News vans lined the street. The world waited to either crucify or celebrate, to tear down or build up. But in that moment, something shifted in the air. As Harold finished speaking, Sarah noticed a single tear roll down his cheek, the first genuine emotion she'd seen from him since that day he'd fallen. And suddenly, she knew exactly what Eleanor had seen in him all those years ago. Not just a man in need of saving, but a soul capable of saving others. The real question was, would the world see it too? The next 24 hours unfolded like a fever dream. Morrison Revenge gave way to Eleanor's legacy. The video of their diner interview went viral, not for its scandal, but for its raw humanity. A billionaire's tears, a waitress's strength, and a dead woman's wisdom, bridging the gap between vengeance and grace. Morning shows scrambled to reframe their coverage. Breaking news: Morrison's revenge plot transforms into $8 billion charitable foundation, scrolled across screens nationwide. Social media erupted with people sharing their own stories of redemption, of second chances, of choosing forgiveness over fury. But in the quiet corner booth of Rosemary's Diner, Sarah sat alone, reading Eleanor's diary for the 4th time. The morning sun painted patterns across the worn pages, illuminating sentences that felt like personal messages. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones carrying the deepest wounds. True power isn't in breaking others, but in helping them rebuild. Her phone buzzed. Another interview request. She'd lost count after the first 50. Everyone wanted to hear more about Harold's transformation, about Eleanor's influence, about Sarah's role in the foundation. The bell above the door chimed. Sarah looked up to see Harold entering, looking oddly vulnerable in a simple button-down shirt rather than his usual suit. "Your board meeting?" she asked as he slid into the booth across from her. "Survived. Barely." He managed a tired smile. "Half of them resigned in protest. The other half want to expand the foundation's scope." "And you?" He paused, studying the coffee stains on the table. "I found more names, in Eleanor's other diaries. People I'd forgotten hurting, lives I'd casually ruined because I could." Sarah nodded toward the stack of papers beside her. "That's why I've been going through the foundation applications. Hundreds already, and it's only been a day." "Any stand out?" "A few." She pulled out a particular file. "Remember James Thompson's daughter, the one who had to drop out of college?" Harold's expression tightened with recognition. "She wants to start a program," Sarah continued, "for kids whose families lost everything to corporate takeovers. Education grants, counseling, career guidance. Using our mistakes to prevent more damage," Harold murmured. "Eleanor would have loved that." The diner's usual morning bustle flowed around them, but something had changed. Customers who normally rushed through their coffee now lingered, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Hope, maybe. Or recognition of their own capacity for both cruelty and kindness. "You know what's strange?" Sarah said, closing Eleanor's diary gently. "A week ago, I would have given anything to see you suffer like I suffered. Now I realize that's exactly what Eleanor was trying to prevent. An endless cycle of hurt people hurting people." Harold reached across the table, touching the diary's worn cover. "She always said that grace was the only force powerful enough to break that cycle." He smiled sadly. "I never understood what she meant until I read about you. About how you shared your lunch with that homeless man even when you could barely afford to eat yourself." "That day?" Sarah's voice caught. "That was the day I met Eleanor, wasn't it? When she left that big tip and the note about kindness mattering. She came home and wrote about you for hours." Harold pulled out his phone, showing Sarah a new email. "Which is why this feels right." Sarah read the email, a formal offer to serve as the Eleanor Morrison Foundation's first executive director. "Me?" she whispered. "But I don't have the experience, the education. You have something better." Harold gestured to the diary. "You understand Eleanor's vision, not just about helping people, but about transforming lives through grace, including mine." Through the diner's windows, they could see reporters still camped outside, waiting for the next chapter of their story. But somehow, their presence felt less intrusive now, more like witnesses to something genuine unfolding. There will be challenges, Harold warned. People who don't believe in change, who will call this a publicity stunt. Sarah smiled, thinking of Eleanor's words about true strength. Then we'll prove them wrong, one life at a time. She held out her hand. Partners? Harold stared at her offered hand, the same hand that had served him coffee the day he fell, the same hand that had once symbolized everything he wanted to crush. Now it represented everything Eleanor had hoped he'd become. Partners, he agreed, shaking her hand firmly. Outside, the city hummed with morning energy. Inside, two unlikely allies began planning how to transform an act of revenge into a legacy of redemption. And somewhere, perhaps, Eleanor smiled. 1 year later, the Eleanor Morrison Foundation's first annual gala filled Sweet Haven's garden with an unlikely gathering. Corporate leaders beside former adversaries, wealthy donors alongside grant recipients. Lives once broken now intertwined and healing. Sarah stood at the podium, Eleanor's diary in her hands. A year ago, I stood in this garden wanting revenge. Today, I stand here understanding what Eleanor knew all along, that true strength isn't in breaking others, but in helping them rebuild. In the front row, Harold Morrison sat beside James Thompson, their past enmity transformed into partnership. The foundation had already helped thousands rebuild their lives, students back in school, small businesses restored, families given second chances. Eleanor wrote that every act of kindness creates ripples we might never see, Sarah continued. She was right. One diary changed 2 lives, and those 2 lives helped change a city. Harold joined her at the podium, different now from the man who'd once plotted revenge. Eleanor asked me to choose between an empire of broken souls and a legacy of healed ones, he said simply. Tonight, I'm transferring the remainder of my wealth to the foundation. All of it. As the crowd erupted in applause, Sarah found a loose page in the diary's back cover. Eleanor's final message read, "To whoever finds their way to these pages, remember that every story of revenge can become a story of redemption. We just have to be brave enough to write the next chapter." Sometimes life breaks us. Sometimes we break others. But in those moments of darkness, we have a choice, to let our pain become poison or to transform it into purpose. You might not have billions to give away. You might not have the power to change an entire city, but you have something just as valuable, the ability to choose kindness over cruelty, healing over hurting, grace over grudges. Look around. Someone near you is carrying a burden you can't see, fighting a battle you don't understand. Maybe they wronged you. Maybe you wronged them. Today, right now, you can choose to break the cycle, because in the end, it's not about revenge or redemption. It's about remembering who we are when we're at our best, and helping others find their way back to their best selves, too. Be brave enough to write the next chapter. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to keep up with all our stories, and be sure to check out more emotional stories by clicking here on the end screen. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.